This webinar is supported by funding awarded by Victims of Crime Act and Violence Against Women, VAWA, throughout the California Government's Office of Emergency Services, or CalOES. The opinions, findings, and conclusions in this webinar are those of the author and not necessarily those of CalOES. CalOES reserves a royalty-free, non-exclusive, and irrevocable license to reproduce, publish, and use these materials, and to authorize others to do so. Again, I am one of CalCASA's Training and Technical Assistance Specialists. I've dedicated my entire professional career to supporting families of marginalized communities. And prior to my work at CalCASA, I provided direct advocacy support to families under the Differential Response Program in Orange County. I've also spent several years working directly with children and adults with intellectual disabilities. During that time, I provided supervision and training to families and staff based on applied behavior analysis techniques. At CalCASA, I work in collaboration with Death Detention International to fulfill the objectives of the California Advancing PREA project, which goal is to bring the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation into compliance with the Prison Rape Elimination Act. The project provides hands-on technical assistance for both CDCR and California Rape Crisis Centers with state prisons in their service areas, and I provide ongoing technical assistance to California Rape Crisis Centers servicing incarcerated survivors in a range of facilities. The California Coalition Against Sexual Assault provides leadership, vision, and resources to rape crisis centers, individuals, and other entities committed to ending sexual violence. CalCASA envisions a world free from sexual violence, and we are committed to ending sexual violence through a multifaceted approach of prevention, intervention, education, research, advocacy, and public policy. So, to start, I like to always bring in our communities that we're talking about to the center of the conversation. This is a poem by Amy Walker, who is a self-advocate. The poem is titled, "You Raped Me First with Your Mind." I'm in a disclosure that you'll hear the word self-advocate throughout the web conference. And for the purpose of this web conference, self-advocate is someone who has learned to speak up for themselves and the things that are important to them. They can ask for what they need or what they want. This poem by Amy Walker, I love. She shares her experience of her own victimization. So I invite you to read it at your disclosure during your own time so you can start thinking of centering the voice of those self-advocates to the work that we're going to do. And all of us, whether advocates, survivors, or both, possess multiple intersection identities. None of us is fully identified or definable as a member of one group only. Whether targeted or privileged, persons living with disabilities often face being defined and labeled by their perceived disability, rather than by being seen as a whole person. People with disabilities have historically had people around them making decisions that impact their lives. Other people decide what they can do, what they need, and what they can have. One of the most challenging aspects of servicing survivors is ensuring that you're providing appropriate services to all, no matter their background. Yet services for people with disabilities who continue to be victimized at a higher rate than the rest of the population seem to be overlooked. During this web conference, we will identify appropriate collaboration strategies between our local rape crisis centers and other agencies that provide support to people with disabilities while empowering the survivor. And again, I encourage you to ask questions, be interactive. If you have any comments, feel free to raise your hand or type them in the chat box. So rape crisis centers in California provide services to a diverse community of sexual violence survivors, including persons with disabilities. In fact, persons with disabilities are one of the largest minority groups in the United States. It's estimated that the population of Americans with disabilities range from 39.1 million to 54 million, depending on the way disability is measured or defined. From the prevention perspective, people with developmental disabilities have many more risk factors, mostly due to social and environmental factors. They're sometimes isolated, often taught to be compliant, not giving critical information, overprotective, marginalized, segregated, and sexually assaulted at alarming rates, sometimes denying them of their basic human rights. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, in 2014, the rate of rape and sexual assault against people with intellectual disabilities is more than 7 times the rate against people without disabilities. Among women with intellectual disabilities, it's about 12 times that rate. The violent victimization rate against persons with disabilities was more than twice the rate of persons without disabilities. The ARC shares that 50% of all violence against persons with disabilities occurs against victims with multiple disabilities, meaning they have more than one identified disability. The Bureau of Justice Statistics also shares that a person with cognitive disabilities have the highest rates of total violent crimes, serious violent crimes, and simple assault among the disability types measured. Those with hearing disabilities have the lowest rates of total violent victimization during their data collection years of 2010 to 2014. Crimes such as rape of sexual assault, robbery, and aggravated assault accounted for a greater percentage of violence against persons with disabilities than violence against persons without disabilities. 1 in 5 violent crimes, crime victims with disabilities believe that they were targeted because of those disabilities. We know that about 70% of all abuse cases against those with disabilities go unreported. Additional research from the Bureau of Justice Statistics shares that the total violence against persons with ambulatory disabilities was more likely to be reported to police than violence against persons with vision or self-care disabilities. These staggering statistics point out that extremely low reporting and disclosure rates for survivors with disabilities, or we would be serving far more survivors with disabilities in our centers. Some of the possible reasons is that they're not believed, they're not seen as accurate historians, often live or spend time in controlled environments, such as a day treatment program, group homes, institutions, or continue to live with families as adults. Often have caretakers that perform personal hygiene duties, such as bathing, toileting, and clothing. Caregivers are often underpaid, lack training, and do not stay in these positions long term. Therefore, there are few thorough background checks. The perpetrators seek out those positions to have contact with potential victims, and other employees may think no one would want to rape these people or be afraid of losing their jobs if they report. Often receiving no sex education or are seen as asexual, which creates more vulnerability to perpetrator tactics. Deception and misinformation, and they're thought to be compliant, and as we often hear, they're not seen as good witnesses because of all the things that we mentioned prior. And most of the time, they know their offender. This infographic by the ARC shows that 66% of our acquaintances, intimate partners, or other relatives. Higher rates compared to the 34% offenders who are strangers or are unknown to the survivor. At this point, I'd like to see if there's any questions, any thoughts with this information. I feel like a lot of this we've heard before throughout some of the services that we're doing, but it's good to just go back and take a look at it. And again, this is not going to be a Disabilities 101. It's more of centering the work that we're doing as rape crisis centers. So it's always good to have that information in the back of our head. Now, the following suggestions come from a collection of reading materials, which in some cases include people with disabilities, disability advocates, service providers. They're more of a guide to respectful approaches and behaviors, but because of the diversity and complexity of individuals, will not address every situation or be welcomed by every individual. It is always appropriate to ask someone how he or she would like to be treated and what accommodations may be helpful or necessary. And as we move forward, we'll talk a little bit about the difference of accommodation and modifications and centering the work that we're doing with survivors. Again, reminder that accessibility is not solely done through your agency, and that accessibility can mean reaching out to others who have the capacity to provide appropriate support. And I really will encourage everyone to keep that in mind as we're moving forward in creating accessibility, because sometimes as nonprofits, we understand that we might not have the capacity to make all the changes or to provide all the information, all the resources to those who we are servicing. So we want to remember that our capacity is measured by bringing others into the work as well. So here are some of the things to remember just in the general spectrum of talking or servicing any individual or any person with disabilities. Remember that you are speaking to an adult. Talk to the survivor, not the support person, or the caregiver, or the interpreter, or the assistant. Don't call a child abuse center or a child advocate to respond to a SART call with an adult with disabilities. Use caution when allowing a caregiver to be in the room during an interview. They might be a potential perpetrator, acquaintance of the perpetrator, or otherwise present a subtle or overt threat to the survivor about telling the truth or naming the perpetrator. The survivor with a disability has the right to decide who is in the room during the SART exam. Also, be aware of any accommodations that might help aid communication, such as an ASL interpreter, understanding, so altering vocabulary use, or mobility, giving the victim with visual impairments information about the layout of the room. Let the survivor decide how to communicate. Utilize other measures or methods of communication, for example, write, sign, or speak the message. Have written materials available in alternative formats, such as large print or audio type or a picture. If you see that a possible accommodation might be made, ask the victim's permission before helping. Avoid talking down to the person or speaking to an adult like a child. People with disabilities have the same right to confidentiality with the rape crisis counselor or advocate as other survivors. The information they disclose cannot be shared with a caregiver, parent, social worker, guardians, law enforcement, etc. And avoid euphemisms such as physically challenged, differently abled, or handicapable. Many disability groups and individuals with disabilities object to these phrases because they're considered condescending and reinforce the idea that disabilities cannot be spoken of or in a front or direct manner. Again, I encourage you, if you have any questions, any thoughts, please share them with us as we go on. Now, here are some considerations for survivors with blindness and visual impairments. Speak directly to the person in a normal tone and speed. Use details to describe people, objectives, objects, and places throughout. It's especially important to announce oneself when entering and leaving a room with a person who is blind and has a visual impairment. When introducing a person who is blind to a group, introduce each person individually to guide a person who is blind. Also let them know that you're going to take their arm and that you're going to guide them. And identify obstacles as you're about to encounter them. Have optical magnifiers and other optical aids available, such as braille printer materials. When using telephone numbers with words such as like 188, an example would be 188-9 Pakasa. Be sure to include the number version as well, since letters and telephone buttons can be difficult to read. And again, this is one of the things where we encourage, if your agency doesn't have the capacity to bring in braille or purchase a large print material, to bring other agencies that might be willing to donate that to you or who might be willing to provide services with you at the same time. Another consideration is to ask before touching or petting a service animal. It may distract the animal from working. It is best not to touch them at all because they're not pets. So ensure that service animals have full access to the same facilities as the person they're serving. Their right is also guaranteed by law. And I think that's one of the things that we forget as we sometimes interact with service animals. We see them as a pet, while in reality they are working. So that's a big one, and I've heard that over and over again, that it's very important for us to ask before petting them or interacting with the service animal because they are working at that time. Some considerations for survivors with physical disabilities or mobility impairments. Wheelchairs are part of a person's personal space, so try not to lean on them or touch or otherwise maneuver someone's chair without permission. If you see that an accommodation may be appropriate, ask the survivor before you proceed. Would you like some help getting out of the chair, for example? Use floor coverings that allow easy mobility. Relocate services and programs to accessible spaces. And replace existing car work and equipment to allow for grab bars, handrails, and other supports where needed. Always ask for permission. Don't touch or move a cane, prosthetic, wheelchair, braces, etc. of the survivor. Allow the survivor to tell you her or his needs, and don't bombard with questions. Seek to communicate with people at an even level physically. For example, if someone is using a wheelchair, sit down or kneel when conversing for an extended period of time. And all of the cultural competency and successful outreach will be unproductive if a client cannot utilize the facilities of a rape crisis center. The Americans with Disabilities Act provide guidelines for ensuring accessibility to public agencies, and it's important to know that many accommodations are inexpensive. So one thing to consider is organizing a volunteer work party for one-time adaptations, such as building a ramp if you have the capacity for that, or installing handrails or stairways or other forms of stability tools in your bathrooms or other locations. Again, this is a good time where you start taking a look at your capacity and what you're able to do and how you're going to be able to bring others to support you in that if you do not have the capacity to do that. Some considerations for deaf or hard of hearing survivors. If the survivor signs, always call for an ASL interpreter. Learn how to find a sign language interpreter on short notice. That's key. Speak directly to the person who is deaf, not the sign language interpreter. Make eye contact and speak to the survivor directly, even if you're using an ASL interpreter. You can try using notes or lip reading until an interpreter is available if this is okay with the survivor. But be aware that not all deaf people read lips. If you're using lip reading, look at the person, don't turn away mid-sentence, don't eat or cover your mouth, and there's no need to speak loudly or exaggerate your enunciation for lip reading. Ask the person to repeat themselves if you don't understand. Use facial expressions, body language. The deaf community is often like a small town, so many people know one another. So this may mean that the survivor might be concerned about confidentiality or privacy. Do not use a partner, parent, friend, or law enforcement as the ASL interpreter. And respect what is called deaf culture. This includes that people in the deaf community do not see deafness as a disability, and therefore do not necessarily use people's first language. Be respectful that their deaf survivors have the right to refuse so-called treatments for deafness, such as a cochlear implant. Be aware when given resources that many deaf survivors want to maintain social circles in the deaf community and would rather receive services within the deaf community. Isolation of deaf people within the hearing community may make reporting difficult. Some considerations for survivors with intellectual disabilities. Adults with intellectual and cognitive disabilities are not children. They're adults and deserve to be treated as such. The role of a crisis counselor and advocates as non-judgmental sources of support and information is especially important in order to empower the survivor to make decisions that affect their lives. Learn to listen first and then talk. Intellectual and cognitive disabilities are not always visible. Go over any handouts or pamphlets verbally to check for understanding. Make it more comfortable to say no by asking, am I making sense, rather than, do you understand? Ask the person to repeat what they understood about the information. Society is still not looking at people with intellectual disabilities as sexual beings, and they have the right to have information and knowledge on sexuality and the right to healthy relationships. This is only the surface So I actually invite you to review Creating Access, Supporting Survivors of Sexual Assault with Disabilities, to learn more about other disabilities that we haven't mentioned in the last couple of slides. And again, these are just considerations, things that you can start thinking about when you are thinking about the capacity of your agency when servicing survivors with disabilities. Again, considerations just means that if you have the ability and capacity, apply those. And if you don't, it means that you need to search or look for other resources that might be able to provide these, the access to these resources. And again, we encourage if you have any questions, any comments, any thoughts to type them in the chat box. We encourage you to raise your hand as well if you have any, if you like to speak the question instead. So I feel like this is the part where, as rape crisis centers, we have a bigger challenge because we do want to provide the services to survivors in-house, and we want to have the ability to do that. But we also have to understand, again, that our capacity means that we have to be able to work with others and provide resources that we might not have available. During this section, we're going to talk a little bit about MOUs, where I'll discuss a little bit more about having an internal plan of what to do when you do not have those services accessible. The community collaboration and outreach, they help improve both the use of rape crisis center services and the effectiveness of services to survivors of sexual assault with disabilities. The following outreach strategies are just suggestions as initial steps in designing individualized strategies for your communities. They're by no means exhausting and may include actions your center has already taken, which I feel like you probably have. It is also important to identify that not all of the following strategies are within the capacity of your agency. Barriers like budget, staffing, development of building, and others may be a very real barrier to direct services. As we go through the variety of outreach strategies, we will point out ways in which you could internally develop a plan that would be appropriate for your agency and survivors. So how can we bring the community in? Well, some of the things that we can do is we can contact local branches of agencies that provide disability advocacy services or resources. We can request information on their services and programs, offer to meet with them and send them information about rape crisis centers in return. You can also, your local service providers, keep an eye on your local service providers or advocacy agencies for people who, for example, are blind or have visual impairments, and may be able to assist in tape recording. They might be able to, record your brochures, or might have access to survivors' right handouts at a larger print, or even in Braille. Recruit volunteers to tape record agency brochures or handouts for use by persons who are blind. That could also be an option. And you can even consider making a requirement of training and audio tape handouts, brochures, or training manuals. So that's all bringing the community in and identifying people that might be able to support you with that. We always encourage you to develop an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, that outlines clear procedures on accessing agencies in your community that provide services to persons with disabilities. Identify your agency's capacity and have realistic expectations. When developing the MOUs, think of the services that you have and the capacity and accessibility you can provide. Develop an internal policy and procedure, documents that identify the appropriate steps to best support the survivor. For example, if you don't have a rep access, what would be a better location to meet? Identify an agency that can support you with the access. If you have no budget for large print or Braille material, who can you reach out to provide these things at a short notice? Contact local service agencies like regional centers, deaf service agencies, and independent living centers. Agencies that serve people with developmental disabilities may be willing to collaborate on a pictorial explanation of rape crisis center services, the sexual assault response team, or benefits of counseling for survivors with developmental disabilities, or others who cannot read or are visual learners. The ARC actually has an amazing list of visuals that can be easily downloaded and printed as a PDF with pictures of feelings and pictures of a human's anatomy that can be utilized for these conversations as well. Training. We always feel like training is one of the most important resources and tools because you can bring in conversations, and that's how you can begin identifying challenges that you are experiencing internally in your agency. And not only are we talking about training internally, but we're talking about training, cross-training from other agencies. So we say that you can propose staff cross-training on issues of sexual assault and disabilities. Many agencies that serve people living with disabilities do not have specific rape crisis centers, rape crisis training. Some may have specific staff to support with issues of abuse, but who may not be aware of sexual assault dynamics or service available to survivors at rape crisis centers. Many service providers may be willing to present at volunteer training or provide continuing education to your center. We also invite you to contact your local school for the deaf in the community, and so they might be able to offer or provide rape prevention or self-defense classes with an ASL interpreter. You can develop education presentations tailored to people with particular disabilities. Discuss presentation outline ahead of time with service providers or disability advocates just to make sure that the presentation will be accessible and pertinent. Presentations to persons with intellectual disabilities may require a more in-depth discussion about sexuality than rape crisis centers and may normally provide that you might normally provide. So exploring what type of information on sexuality has already been provided to the audience will greatly assist educators in preparing an effective presentation. Again, they have the right to be informed, they have the right to be educated, so as you're doing this training, and even as you begin to do some of the community outreach, remember that you have to bring the people within those communities to the center of the conversation. So include them in these trainings, include them in the reach out. Ask what they feel would be more appropriate for their services. Now, we can talk about outreach to the community, we can talk about the training, and what about the materials that we have available? I love this picture right here where it says accommodations versus modification. If we're not as involved within the community, within the disability community, we sometimes can think that they're the same or mix them up. One of the things that I've learned throughout my years of the work that I'm doing is that it's important to identify them both. Because accommodations is more of what can I do to provide the same services that I'm providing to another survivor. Modifications are the changes that will be applied. So keep that in mind. If you're accommodating for someone with a wheelchair, you're providing the same services except you're adding the ramp. If you're modifying a document for someone with a developmental or intellectual disability, then you are changing the language. You are making it accessible to their needs so that they can understand what you're talking about. Some of the things when we're talking about materials is that it's important to contact local agencies that serve persons with disabilities so that they can share handouts, brochures, and pamphlets with survivors. You might not be that first person that they reach out. It might be that agency. So make sure that they have your information. Collaborate on how to make them accessible for people living with various disabilities, and ask to put those brochures in the lobby or information kiosks. Be sure to include pictures or photographs of persons with disabilities in publications and newsletters to represent the diversity of the community you center. Again, if they don't see someone that looks like them, they might not be willing to ask for support from you. Incorporate survivor stories and from persons living with disabilities into the training and presentation. Again, going back to one of the earlier slides, the poem that I provided was written by a self-advocate, so those are the words of the self-advocate in describing the violence that they encounter. Ensure that inclusive statements such as, please contact us about any accommodation needs, are included in your agency brochures and publications, along with statements about the agency's commitment to serving survivors of sexual violence living with disabilities. So what are you as an agency doing to provide these services or to have an agency who has the capacity to work with someone with disabilities? Making rape crisis center brochures and handouts available in large print will also assist people with low vision or other visual impairments. Make copies available at rape crisis centers and agencies that serve people who are blind or have visual impairments. Always remember that the work that you're doing, the materials that you're creating, and the services that you're providing that are bringing those survivors to the center of the work. Centering survivors with disabilities means bringing them into the conversations, allowing them to let you know again what their needs are, and identifying really their capacity as well. Identify if they need some other support system, identify if they need to see visual things instead of listening to what you're saying. Bring them into the conversation when you are developing these materials and when you are reaching out to others to provide that support as well. Again, I encourage you if you have any questions, any comments, if you want to share of any of your experiences of working with a survivor with disabilities, I would love to hear that as well. I'm going to, next step is kind of talking about the prevention strategies, but I really like to hear a little bit more about some of the work that you are doing within your agency that is now centering survivors with disabilities. So here are some prevention strategies, and again, these are all just strategies, considerations. They're just the top of just a can of information that we can provide. Just like disabilities, there's not one size fits all strategy for anything. It's going to depend on, first of all, your capacity. It's going to depend on the survivor and their disability and their needs. And it's going to depend on a lot of the services that or the community resources that you have available. Again, I can't elaborate enough that it's important to know that if you don't have the capacity, that bringing someone else is going to be the best for the survivor. Here are some prevention strategies. And perhaps the most important aspect of addressing sexual violence against persons living with disabilities is a committed effort to prevent such assaults from occurring in the first place. Comprehensive prevention of sexual assault incorporates education about gender stereotypes, forms of oppression, social norms, and sexism behaviors and systems. Educating the community about the roots of sexual violence will provide tools for individuals to change attitudes and behaviors that will bring about safer community and ultimately prevent sexual violence. And the following are prevention strategies that could help rape crisis centers. Again, they're just some ideas, but we invite you to give us your own ideas, things that you are already doing and things that you have been implementing in your agency. Include persons with disabilities in the community. An important aspect of preventing sexual assault against persons with disabilities is changing the dynamic of isolation that increases their vulnerability to sexual assault. Persons with disabilities are often taught and rewarded for compliance because this allows their service provider to manage their need more effectively. Persons with disabilities are more likely to learn skills and behaviors that improve their personal safety in their natural environment. Including persons with disabilities in prevention, education, intervention, and other services provided by rape crisis centers is important because it allows persons with disabilities to be exposed to models of personal safety and empowerment such as self-defense and advocacy. Another strategy would be incorporating the issues of disabilities into existing prevention efforts. Rape crisis centers in California already provide rape prevention education in the communities. They have some existing curricula that can be adapted to incorporate issues of sexual assault against persons with disabilities for presentations throughout the community, whether providing prevention education, excuse me, I lost my place here, whether providing prevention education at schools, juvenile halls, for law enforcement, and for other community resources as well. Now, expand the prevention efforts. What does that mean? Expanding the prevention efforts means that you're going to have conversations with other community members, that you're not going to keep the information to yourself, that you're going to be able to interact with family members, that you're going to be able to interact with schools, that you're going to try to share the information and the knowledge you have with others, as well as including persons with disabilities and their service providers as their primary audience. So don't just do that to those that are coming into your center. Go out there and reach out to other communities, especially the service providers who are interacting with survivors with disabilities on a daily basis. Intervention and prevention for survivors and perpetrators. Perpetrators of sexual assault against persons with disability are often people they know. Providing rape prevention education to staff and volunteers at assisted living centers, foster care placements, adult care facilities, day programs, independent living centers, regional centers, disability advocacy agencies, and others to serve people with disabilities is essential to preventing sexual violence before it occurs. Re-victimization for survivors, rates for survivors of sexual assault are high. So providing intervention services and prevention education to survivors of sexual assault with disabilities can help to prevent survivors from being re-victimized. One of the things that I've learned as I did a lot of my work in the group homes was that there wasn't a lot of training from other agencies. We didn't get reach out from our local rape crisis centers or other agencies. A lot of the information came from the regional center. So if you have the ability to reach out to your local regional center, have conversations with them, and see how you can provide these trainings to their staff, or how you can work and collaborate together so that the prevention is there and we can educate as much as we can, not only those who are providing the services, but again to the people with disabilities as well. So I see that we have one question. So approximately how many RCCs and or member agencies have services deliveries for persons with disabilities? So we'd like to hear if you have any relationship with your local rape crisis centers. I see that we have some of our guests joining from New York. We have others from Tulare County. I'm wondering if Tulare County has a rape crisis center close to them. If you can share if you do. Salinas, I know that they're in California, the rape crisis, the regional centers are all over, but they're centered in major communities, and they service tons of cities. For example, the LA Regional Center services, I believe, 5 to 6 cities. So they're there. They're just extend to the ability of the services in the cities that they're providing services to. So again, it's important for us to go and reach out to them as they, as members of the communities that they are servicing. So if you reach out to them, I'm sure that they're going to want to use you as a tool for additional support. Reach out to them. So if you can share with us some of that, that would be great. So here is another poem, and this one is by Brenda Henson and Amy Walker. This is titled One Victim's Voice. And I actually want to read this one, and the reason I want to read it is so that I can start, so we can think about the words that both Brenda and Amy use, and just maybe have a brief discussion or a dialogue of how our services can impact victims just like Brenda and Amy. So I am a person, so treat me like you. Don't hurt me, abuse me, or embarrass me too. I think and I feel and I will speak out. If someone does hurt me, I'll stand up and shout. Listen to me and believe what I say, because if you don't, the hurt won't go away. Help me to get well and heal my pain. And don't let these kinds of things happen again. If someone hurts me, then lock them away, but still give them help so that they will not stray. And hurt someone else. If you do this for me, then I will be glad I spoke out. I'm set free. The reason why I feel this poem is super just strong, the words that they're saying are super powerful, is because these victims who have some sort of intellectual disability have talked about, in their own way, how they were hurt and how the perpetrator tried to do several things. And at the end, what they want is to be able to provide some sort of support and help also for the perpetrator. I feel like it's very important to keep in mind that a lot of our victims, especially those with disabilities, like mentioned before, know who their perpetrator is. They don't want to hurt them. And that's one of the things that usually correlates with the underreporting, where they know that person, they've created a bond with that individual. They don't want them to be hurt. They don't want them to be locked up because of the way that we've, taught them about law enforcement and how law enforcement is there to provide or put someone away. This poem reminds me that they just want healing and they just want the bad things to go away or to stop, but they want to help that individual as well. So it's very powerful because I feel like even though we get really upset with knowing that someone with a disability was a victim of some sort of sexual violence, individual with a disability was a victim of sexual violence, at the end of the day, what they want to do is just educate those as well and be able to be provided services that are appropriate for their needs. So I see that we have another question here. Is there a focus on persons with disabilities during SAM? And I actually would like to share some of our resources. We have a few that I absolutely love. We have the Bureau of Justice Statistics, who does a lot of research when it comes to the community with disabilities. A lot of the data that we have is from them, so I encourage you to read some of their data research as well. It's very interesting, and it provides a lot of knowledge and understanding as well. The California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, our site actually houses 2 toolkits that aim to service providers in the communities or rape crisis centers who provide services to individuals with disabilities. One is on the type of services, and the other one is how you can apply these services as well. The ARC is for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. They actually have a variety, again, of tools and resources that can be downloaded as a PDF to utilize for anyone, really. I actually, when I did a lot of the work with children, I used a lot of the materials that they had. Don't reinvent the wheel. If the information is there and the resources are there, then just get them, borrow them as well. The Vera Institute of Justice has a lot of information as well. They've done a lot of research. They do a lot of programming specifically to different communities with disabilities. They have amazing reading materials and a lot of articles and videos, actually, that can help bring the survivors with disabilities to the center of the work and can help us as people outside of that community understand a little bit more of the community with disabilities. So again, is there any questions, any thoughts, anything that we are just wanting to have a dialogue about? Again, this is not a Disability 101 webinar. This is more of how is the work that we're doing as Rape Crisis Center bringing survivors with disabilities to the work that we are doing. Are we thinking of, again, modifications and adaptations that are appropriate for that, for someone with a disability? Are we thinking of the resources and the outreach that we're doing to the community to provide appropriate resources for survivors with disabilities? What are we doing in order to provide these things? You know, we've only touched the surface of all this information, and really we can have long conversations about this, but unless we talk to that individual with disabilities, then we're not really going to be able to identify some of the needs and some of the things that we need or that we need to change within our own agency. So I definitely encourage all of you to reach out to your local regional center. If you need the information of your local regional center, you can reach out to me, and I have a list of that, or you can visit the State of California website and search regional centers for California at least. For New York, I'm not sure, but I'm sure that I can get the information. Google is a really good friend, so Google might be able to give us those answers as well. I also encourage you to just be aware of your local agencies that might be within a couple miles of your own agency. They are great resources and they are a great support system, so reach out to them. You know, collaboration is, again, the key to providing the best support to survivors with disabilities. Looks like we don't have too many questions, and that's okay. I really hope that that the information that we provided today gives you at least some insight of what to start thinking when you are beginning to apply some of these changes to your agencies, or you might already be doing these things. Again, it's just the surface of all the information that we can provide. If you need additional information, if you need to have more of in-depth assessment of the work that you're doing, please feel free to reach out. Again, I am one of CACASA's Training and Technical Assistance Specialists. My email and my phone and my number with extension is available here in front of you in one of the PowerPoints and one of the slides. So I encourage you to reach out if you have any questions. You know, I hope you have an amazing day. And remember that centering survivors with disabilities means that you're able to reach out to really identify the capacity of your agency in providing services to them. It's not just being able to talk to someone with a disability or build a ramp. So it takes a little bit more than that, and I encourage you to please reach out if you have any questions. So thank you so much, everyone, and I know it's short and sweet, but I hope that you took in a lot of information. Have an amazing day, everyone.